Section 21. She admits that she heard me ring, and then knock, that she knew it was myself, that she wanted to see me, Swann thought to himself. But that doesn't correspond with the fact that she did not let me in. He did not, however, draw her attention to this inconsistency, for he thought that if left to herself, Oded might perhaps produce some falsehood which would give him a faint indication of the truth. She spoke. He did not interrupt her. He gathered up with an eager and sorrowful piety the words that fell from her lips, feeling, and rightly feeling, since she was hiding the truth behind them as she spoke, that, like the veil of a sanctuary, they kept a vague imprint, traced a faint outline, that infinitely precious and, alas, undiscoverable truth, what she had been doing that afternoon at 3 o'clock when he called, a truth of which he would never possess any more than these falsifications, illegible and divine traces, a truth which would exist henceforward only in the secretive memory of this creature, who would contemplate it in utter ignorance of its value, but would never yield it up to him. It was true that he had, now and then, a strong suspicion that Odette's daily activities were not themselves passionately interesting, and that such relations as she might have with other men did not exhale, naturally, in a universal sense, or for every rational being, a spirit of morbid gloom, capable of infecting with fever or of inciting to suicide. He realized at such moments that interest, that gloom, existed in him only as a malady might exist, and that once he was cured of the malady, the actions of Odette, the kisses that she might have bestowed, would become once again as innocuous as those of countless other women. But the consciousness that the painful curiosity with which Swann now studied them had its origin only in himself was not enough to make him decide that it was unreasonable to regard that curiosity as important, and to take every possible step to satisfy it. Swann had, in fact, reached an age the philosophy of which, supported in this case by the current philosophy of the day, as well as by that of the circle in which he spent most of his life, the group that surrounded the Princesse des Laumes, in which one's intelligence was understood to increase with the strength of one's disbelief in everything, and nothing real and incontestable was to be discovered except the individual tastes of its members, the philosophy of which is no longer that of youth, but a positive, almost a medical philosophy, the philosophy of men who, instead of fixing their aspirations upon external objects, endeavor to separate from the accumulation of the years already spent a definite residue of habits and passions which they can regard as characteristic and permanent, and with which they will deliberately arrange, before anything else, that the kind of existence which they choose to adopt shall not prove inharmonious. Swann deemed it wise to make allowance in his life for the suffering which he derived from not knowing what Odette had done, just as he had made allowance for the impetus which a damp climate always gave to his eczema, to anticipate in his budget the expenditure of a considerable sum on procuring, with regard to the daily occupations of Odette, information, the lack of which would make him unhappy, just as he reserved a margin for the gratification of other tastes from which he knew that the pleasure was to be expected, at least before he had fallen in love, such as his taste for collecting things, or for good cooking. When he proposed to take leave of Odette and to return home, she begged him to stay a little longer, and even detained him forcibly, seizing him by the arm as he was opening the door to go. But he gave no thought to that, for among the crowd of gestures and speeches and other little incidents which go to make up a conversation, it is inevitable that we should pass, without noticing anything that arouses our interest, by those that hide a truth for which our suspicions are blindly searching, whereas we stop to examine others beneath which nothing lies concealed. She kept on saying, "What a dreadful pity! You never by any chance come in the afternoon, and the one time you do come, then I miss you." He knew very well that she was not sufficiently in love with him to be so keenly distressed merely at having missed his visit, but as she was a good-natured woman, anxious to give him pleasure, and often felt sorry when she had done anything that annoyed him, he found it quite natural that she should be sorry on this occasion that she had deprived him of that pleasure of spending an hour in her company, which was so very great a pleasure, if not to herself, at any rate to him. All the same, it was a matter of little importance that her air of unrelieved sorrow began at length to bewilder him. She reminded him, even more than was usual, of the faces of some of the women created by the painter of the Primavera. She had at that moment their downcast, heart-broken expression, which seems ready to succumb beneath the burden of a grief too heavy to be borne, when they are merely allowing the infant Jesus to play with a pomegranate, or watching Moses pour water into a trough. He had seen the same sorrow once before on her face, but when, he could no longer say. Then suddenly he remembered it. It was when Oded had lied in apologizing to Madame Verdurin on the evening after the dinner from which she had stayed away on a pretext of illness, but really so that she might be alone with Swann. Surely, even if she had been the most scrupulous of women, she could hardly have felt remorse for so innocent a lie. But the lies which Odette ordinarily told were less innocent, and served to prevent discoveries which might have involved her in the most terrible difficulties with one or another of her friends. And so, when she lied, smitten with fear, feeling herself to be but feebly armed for her defence, unconfident of success, she was inclined to weep from sheer exhaustion, as children weep sometimes when they have not slept. She knew also that her lie, as a rule, was doing a serious injury to the man to whom she was telling it, and that she might find herself at his mercy if she told it badly. Therefore she felt at once humble and culpable in his presence, and when she had to tell an insignificant social lie, its hazardous associations and the memories which it recalled would leave her weak with the sense of exhaustion and penitent with the consciousness of wrongdoing. What depressing lie was she now concocting for Swann's benefit, to give her that pained expression, that plaintive voice, which seemed to falter beneath the effort that she was forcing herself to make, and to plead for pardon? He had an idea that it was not merely the truth about what had occurred that afternoon that she was endeavouring to hide from him, but something more immediate, something, possibly, which had not yet happened, but might happen now at any time, and when it did, would throw a light upon that earlier event. At that moment he heard the front door-bell ring. Odette never stopped speaking, but her words dwindled into an inarticulate moan. Her regret at not seeing Swann that afternoon, at not having opened the door to him, had melted into a universal despair. He could hear the gate being closed, and the sound of a carriage, as though someone were going away, probably the person whom Swann must on no account meet, after being told that Odette was not at home. And then, when he reflected that, merely by coming at an hour when he was not in the habit of coming, he had managed to disturb so many arrangements of which she did not wish him to know, he had a feeling of discouragement that amounted almost to distress. But since he was in love with Odette, since he was in the habit of turning all his thoughts towards her, the pity with which he might have been inspired for himself, he felt for her only, and murmured, "Poor darling." When finally he left her, she took up several letters which were lying on the table, and asked him if he would be so good as to post them for her. He walked along to the post-office, took the letters from his pocket, and before dropping each of them into the box, scanned its address. They were all to tradesmen, except the last, which was to Forcheville. He kept it in his hand. If I saw what was in this, he argued, I should know what she calls him, what she says to him, whether there really is anything between them. Perhaps if I don't look inside, I shall be lacking in delicacy towards Odette, since in this way alone I can rid myself of a suspicion which is perhaps a calumny on her, which must in any case cause her suffering, and which can never possibly be set at rest once the letter is posted. He left the post-office and went home, but he had kept the last letter in his pocket. He lighted a candle, and held up close to its flame the envelope, which he had not dared to open. At first he could distinguish nothing, but the envelope was thin, and by pressing it down on the stiff card which it enclosed, he was able, through the transparent paper, to read the concluding words. They were a coldly formal signature. If instead of its being himself who was looking at a letter addressed to Forcheville, it had been Forcheville who had read a letter addressed to Swann, he might have found words in it of another, a far more tender kind. He took a firm hold of the card, which was sliding to and fro, the envelope being too large for it, and then, by moving it with his finger and thumb, brought one line after another beneath the part of the envelope where the paper was not doubled, through which alone it was possible to read. In spite of all these manoeuvres, he could not make it out clearly. Not that it mattered, for he had seen enough to assure himself that the letter was about some trifling incident of no importance, and had nothing at all to do with love. It was something to do with Odette's uncle. Swann had read quite plainly at the beginning of the line, "I was right," but did not understand what Odette had been right in doing, until suddenly a word which he had not been able at first to decipher came to light and made the whole sentence intelligible. "I was right to open the door. It was my uncle." To open the door! Then Forcheville had been there when Swann rang the bell, and she had sent him away. Hence the sound that Swann had heard. After that he read the whole letter. At the end she apologized for having treated Forcheville with so little ceremony, and reminded him that he had left his cigarette-case at her house, precisely what she had written to Swann after one of his first visits. But to Swann she had added, "Why did you not forget your heart also? I should never have let you have that back." To Forcheville nothing of that sort, no allusion that could suggest any intrigue between them. and really he was obliged to admit that in all the business Forcheville had been worse treated than himself, since Odette was writing to make him believe that her visitor had been an uncle. From which it followed that he, Swann, was the man to whom she attached importance, and for whose sake she had sent the other away. And yet, if there had been nothing between Odette and Forcheville, why not have opened the door at once? Why have said, "I was right to open the door, it was my uncle"? Right? If she was doing nothing wrong at the moment, how could Forcheville possibly have accounted for her not opening the door? For a time Swann stood still there, heart-broken, bewildered, and yet happy, gazing at this envelope which Odette had handed to him without a scruple, so absolute was her trust in his honour. Through its transparent window there had been disclosed to him, with the secret history of an incident which he had despaired of ever being able to learn, a fragment of the life of Odette, seen as through a narrow, luminous incision, cut into its surface without her knowledge. Then his jealousy rejoiced at the discovery, as though that jealousy had an independent existence, fiercely egotistical, gluttonous of everything that would feed its vitality, even at the expense of Swann himself. Now it had food in store, and Swann could begin to grow uneasy afresh every evening over the visits that Odette had received about 5 o'clock, and could seek to discover where Forcheville had been at that hour. For Swann's affection for Odette still preserved the form which had been imposed on it, from the beginning, by his ignorance of the occupations in which she passed her days, as well as by the mental lethargy which prevented him from supplementing that ignorance by imagination. He was not jealous, at first, of the whole of Odette's life, but at those moments only in which an incident, which he had perhaps misinterpreted, had led him to suppose that Odette might have played him false. His jealousy, like an octopus which throws out a first, then a second, and finally a third tentacle, fastened itself irremovably first at that moment, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, then to another again. But Swann was incapable of inventing his sufferings. They were only the memory, the perpetuation of a suffering that had come to him from without. From without, however, everything brought him fresh suffering. He decided to separate Odette from Forcheville by taking her away for a few days to the south, but he imagined that she was coveted by every male person in the hotel, and that she coveted them in return. And so he, who in old days, when he travelled, used always to seek out new people and crowded places, might now be seen fleeing savagely from human society, as if it had cruelly injured him. And how could he not have turned misanthrope, when in every man he saw a potential lover for Odette? Thus his jealousy did even more than the happy, passionate desire which he had originally felt for Odette had done to alter Swann's character, completely changing, in the eyes of the world, even the outward signs by which that character had been intelligible. A month after the evening on which he had intercepted and read Odette's letter to Forcheville, Swann went to a dinner party which the Verdurins were giving in the Bois. As the party was breaking up, he noticed a series of whispered discussions between Madame Verdurin and several of her guests, and thought that he heard the pianist being reminded to come next day to a party at Chatou. Now he, Swann, had not been invited to any party. The Verdurins had spoken only in whispers and in vague terms, but the painter, perhaps without thinking, shouted out, "There must be no lights of any sort, and he must play the Moonlight Sonata in the dark, for us to see by." Madame Verdurin, seeing that Swann was within earshot, assumed that the expression in which the twofold desire to make the speaker be quiet and to preserve, oneself, an appearance of guilelessness in the eyes of the listener is neutralized in an intense vacuity, in which the unflinching signs of intelligent complicity are overlaid by the smiles of innocence, an expression invariably adopted by anyone who has noticed a blunder, the enormity of which is thereby at once revealed, if not to those who have made it, at any rate to him in whose hearing it ought not to have been made. Odette seemed suddenly to be in despair, as though she had decided not to struggle any longer against the crushing difficulties of life, and Swann was anxiously counting the minutes that still separated him from the point at which, after leaving the restaurant, while he drove her home, he would be able to ask for an explanation, to make her promise either that she would not go to Chatou next day, or that she would procure an invitation for him also, and to lull to rest in her arms the anguish that still tormented him. At last the carriages were ordered. Madame Verdurin said to Swann, "Good-bye, then. We shall see you soon, I hope," trying by the friendliness of her manner and the constraint of her smile to prevent him noticing that she was not saying, as she would always have until then, "Tomorrow, then, at Chatou, and at my house the day after." Monsieur and Madame Verdurin made Forcheville get into their carriage. Swann's was drawn up behind it, and he waited for theirs to start before helping Odette into his own. "Odette, we'll take you," said Madame Verdurin. "We've kept a little corner specially for you beside Monsieur de Forcheville." "Yes, Madame Verdurin," said Odette meekly. "What? I thought I was to take you home," cried Swann, flinging discretion to the winds, for the carriage door hung open. Time was precious, and he could not, in his present state, go home without her. "But Madame Verdurin has asked me." "That's all right. You can quite well go home alone. We've left you like this dozens of times," said Madame Verdurin. "But I had something important to tell Madame de Crécy." "Very well. You can write it to her instead." "Good-bye," said Odette, holding out her hand. He tried to smile, but could only succeed in looking utterly dejected. "What do you think of the airs that Swann is pleased to put on with us?" Madame Verdurin asked her husband when they had reached home. "I was afraid he was going to eat me, simply because we offered to take Odette back. It really is too bad, that sort of thing. Why doesn't he say straight out that we keep a disorderly house? I can't conceive how Odette can stand such manners. He positively seems to be saying all the time, 'You belong to me.' I shall tell Odette exactly what I think about it all, and I hope she will have the sense to understand me." A moment later she added, inarticulate with rage, "No, but don't you see? The filthy creature!" using unconsciously, and perhaps in satisfaction of the same obscure need to justify herself, like Françoise at Combray, when the chicken refused to die, the very words which the last convulsions of an inoffensive animal in its death agony wring from the peasant who is engaged in taking its life. and when Madame Verdurins' carriage had moved on, and Swanns took its place, his coachman, catching sight of his face, asked whether he was unwell, or had heard bad news. Swann sent him away. He preferred to walk, and it was on foot, through the bois, that he came home. He talked to himself aloud, and in the same slightly affected tone which he had been used to adopt when describing the charms of the little nucleus and extolling the magnanimity of the Verdurins. But just as the conversations, the smiles, the kisses of Odette became as odious to him as he had once found them charming, if they were diverted to others than himself, so the Verdurins' drawing-room, which not an hour before had still seemed to him amusing, inspired with a genuine feeling for art, and even with a sort of moral aristocracy. Now that it was another man than himself whom Odette was going to meet there, to love there without restraint, laid bare to him all its absurdities, its stupidity, its shame. He drew a fanciful picture, at which he shuddered in disgust, of the party next evening at Chatou. Imagine going to Chatou, of all places, like a lot of drapers after closing time. Upon my word, these people are sublime in their smugness. They can't really exist. They must all have come out of one of Labiche's plays. The Cotards would be there, possibly Brichot. Could anything be more grotesque than the lives of these little creatures hanging on to one another like that? They'd imagine they were utterly lost, upon my soul they would, if they didn't all meet again tomorrow at Chatou. Alas, there would be the painter there also, the painter who enjoyed match-making, who would invite Forcheville to come with Odette to his studio. He could see Odette in a dress far too smart for the country, for she is so vulgar in that way, and poor little thing, she is such a fool. He could hear the jokes that Madame Verdurin would make after dinner, jokes which, whoever the bore might be at whom they were aimed, had always amused him, because he could watch Odette laughing at them, laughing with him, her laughter almost a part of his. Now he felt that it was possibly at him that they would make Odette laugh. "What a fetid form of humour!" he exclaimed, twisting his mouth into an expression of disgust so violent that he could feel the muscles of his throat stiffen against his collar. "How, in God's name, can a creature made in his image find anything to laugh at in those nauseating witticisms? The least sensitive nose must be driven away in horror from such stale exhalations. It is really impossible to believe that any human being is incapable of understanding that, in allowing himself merely to smile at the expense of a fellow creature who has loyally held out his hand to her, she is casting herself into a mire from which it will be impossible, with the best will in the world, ever to rescue her. I dwell so many miles above the puddles in which these filthy little vermin sprawl and crawl and bawl their cheap obscenities, that I cannot possibly be spattered by the witticisms of a Verdurin," he cried, tossing up his head and arrogantly straightening his body. "God knows that I have honestly attempted to pull Odette out of that sewer, and to teach her to breathe a nobler and a purer air. But human patience has its limits, and mine is at an end," he concluded, as though this sacred mission to tear Odette away from an atmosphere of sarcasms dated from longer than a few minutes ago, as though he had not undertaken it only since it had occurred to him that those sarcasms might, perchance, be directed at himself, and might have the effect of detaching Odette from him. He could see the pianist sitting down to play the Moonlight Sonata, and the grimaces of Madame Verdurin, in terrified anticipation of the wrecking of her nerves by Beethoven's music. "Idiot! Liar!" he shouted. "And a creature like that imagines that she's fond of art!" she would say to Odette, after deftly insinuating a few words of praise for Forcheville, as she had done so often for himself. "You can make room for Monsieur de Forcheville there, can't you, Odette?" In the dark! Codfish! Pander! Pander was the name he applied also to the music which would invite them to sit in silence, to dream together, to gaze in each other's eyes, to feel for each other's hands. He felt that there was much to be said, after all, for a sternly censorious attitude towards the arts, such as Plato adopted, and Bossuet, and the old school of education in France. In a word, the life which they led at the Verdurins, which he had so often described as genuine, seemed to him now the worst possible form of life, and their little nucleus the most degraded class of society. "It really is," he repeated, "beneath the lowest rung of the social ladder, the nethermost circle of Dante. Beyond a doubt the august words of the Florentine refer to the Verdurins. When one comes to think of it, surely people in society, and though one may find fault with them now and again, still, after all, they are a very different matter from that gang of blackmailers. People in society show a profound sagacity in refusing to know them, or even to dirty the tips of their fingers with them. What a sound intuition there is in that noli me tangere motto of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. He had long since emerged from the paths and avenues of the Bois. He had almost reached his own house, and still, for he had not yet thrown off the intoxication of grief, or his whim of insincerity, but was ever more and more exhilarated by the false intonation, the artificial sonority of his own voice. He continued to perorate aloud in the silence of the night. People in society have their failings, as no one knows better than I, but after all they are people to whom some things, at least, are impossible. So-and-so, a fashionable woman whom he had known, was far from being perfect, but, after all, one did find in her a fundamental delicacy, a loyalty in her conduct, which made her, whatever happened, incapable of a felony, which fixes a vast gulf between her and an old hag like Verdurin. Verdurin! What a name! Oh, there's something complete about them, something almost fine in their trueness to type. They're the most perfect specimens of their disgusting class. Thank God! It was high time that I stopped condescending to promiscuous intercourse with such infamy, such dung. But just as the virtues which he had still attributed an hour or so earlier to the Verdurins would not have sufficed, even though the Verdurins had actually possessed them, if they were not also favoured and protected his love, to excite Swann to that state of intoxication in which he waxed tender over their magnanimity, an intoxication which, even when disseminated through the medium of other persons, could have come to him from Oded alone. So the immortality, had it really existed, which he now found in the Verdurins, would have been powerless if they had not invited Odette with Forcheville and without him, to unstop the vials of his wrath and to make him scarify their infamy. Doubtless Swann's voice showed a finer perspicacity than his own when it refused to utter those words full of disgust at the Verdurins and their circle, and of joy at his having shaken himself free of it, save in an artificial and rhetorical tone, and as though his words had been chosen rather to appease his anger than to express his thoughts. The latter, in fact, while he abandoned himself to invective, were probably, though he did not know it, occupied with a wholly different matter, for once he had reached his house, no sooner had he closed the front door behind him than he suddenly struck his forehead, and making his servant open the door again, dashed out into the street, shouting, in a voice which this time was quite natural, "I believe I have found a way of getting invited to the dinner at Chatou tomorrow." But it must have been a bad way, for Monsieur Swann was not invited. Dr. Cotard, who had been summoned to attend a serious case in the country, had not seen the Verdurins for some days, and had been prevented from appearing at Chatou, and on the evening after this dinner, as he sat down to table at their house, "Why, aren't we going to see Monsieur Swann this evening? He is quite what you might call a personal friend." "I sincerely trust that we shan't," cried Mme. Verdurin. "Heaven preserve us from him! He's too deadly for words, a stupid, ill-bred boor." On hearing these words, Cotard exhibited an intense astonishment, blended with entire submission, as though in the face of a scientific truth which contradicted everything that he had previously believed, but was supported by an irresistible weight of evidence. With timorous emotion, he bowed his head over his plate, and merely replied, "Oh, oh, 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 oh," traversing, in an orderly retirement of his forces, into the depths of his being, along a descending scale, the whole compass of his voice, after which there was no more talk of Swann at the Verdurins. And so that drawing-room which had brought Swann and Odette together became an obstacle in the way of their meeting. She no longer said to him, as she had said in the early days of their love, "We shall meet, anyhow, tomorrow evening. There's a supper-party at the Verdurins. But we shan't be able to meet tomorrow evening. There's a supper-party at the Verdurins." Or else the Verdurins were taking her to the Opéra Comique to see Une Nuit de Cléopâtre, and Swann could read in her eyes that terror lest he should ask her not to go, which, but a little time before, he could not have refrained from greeting with a kiss as it flitted across the face of his mistress, but which now exasperated him. "Yet I'm not really angry," he assured himself, "when I see how she longs to run away and scratch from maggots in that dunghill of cacophony. I'm disappointed, not for myself, but for her, disappointed to find that after living for more than 6 months in daily contact with myself, she has not been capable of improving her mind, even to the point of spontaneously eradicating from it a taste for Victor Mass. More than that, to find that she has not arrived at the stage of understanding that there are evenings on which anyone with the least shade of refinement of feeling should be willing to forego an amusement when she is asked to do so. She ought to have the sense to say, "I shall not go," if it were only from policy, since it is by what she answers now that the quality of her soul will be determined once and for all. And having persuaded himself that it was solely, after all, in order that he might arrive at a favourable estimate of Odette's spiritual worth, that he wished her to stay at home with him that evening instead of going to the Opera Comique, he adopted the same line of reasoning with her, with the same degree of insincerity as he had used it with himself, or even with a degree more, for in her case he was yielding also to the desire to capture her by her own self-esteem. "I swear to you," he told her, shortly before she was to leave for the theatre, "that in asking you not to go, I should hope, were I a selfish man, for nothing so much as that you should refuse, for I have 1,000 other things to do this evening, and I shall feel that I have been tricked and trapped myself, and shall be thoroughly annoyed if, after all, you tell me that you are not going. But my occupations, my pleasures, are not everything. I must think also of you. A day may come when, seeing me irrevocably sundered from you, you will be entitled to reproach me with not having warned you at the decisive hour in which I felt that I was going to pass judgment on you, one of those stern judgments which love cannot long resist. You see, your Nuit de Cléopâtre, what a title, has no bearing on the point. What I must know is whether you are indeed one of those creatures in the lowest grade of mentality and even of charm, one of those contemptible creatures who are incapable of foregoing a pleasure. For if you are such, how could anyone love you? For you are not even a person, a definite, imperfect, but at least perceptible entity. You are a formless water that will trickle down any slope that it may come upon, a fish devoid of memory, incapable of thought, which all its life long in its aquarium will continue to dash itself 100 times a day against a wall of glass, always mistaking it for water. Do you realize that your answer will have the effect, I do not say of making me cease from that moment to love you, that goes without saying, but of making you less attractive to my eyes when I realize that you are not a person, that you are beneath everything in the world, and have not the intelligence to raise yourself 1 inch higher. Obviously, I should have preferred to ask you, as though it had been a matter of little or no importance, to give up your Nuit de Cléopâtre, since you compel me to sully my lips with so abject a name, in the hope that you would go to it none the less. But since I had resolved to weigh you in the balance, to make so grave an issue depend upon your answer, I considered it more honourable to give you due warning. Meanwhile, Oded had shown signs of increasing emotion and uncertainty. Although the meaning of his tirade was beyond her, she grasped that it was to be included among the scenes of reproach or supplication, scenes which her familiarity with the ways of men enabled her, without paying any heed to the words that were uttered, to conclude that men would not make unless they were in love, that from the moment when they were in love it was superfluous to obey them, since they would only be more in love later on. And so she would have heard Swann out with the utmost tranquillity had she not noticed that it was growing late, and that if he went on speaking for any length of time, she would never, as she told him with a fond smile, obstinate but slightly abashed, get there in time for the overture. On other occasions he had assured himself that the one thing which, more than anything else, would make him cease to love her would be her refusal to abandon the habit of lying. Even from the point of view of coquetry, pure and simple, he had told her, can't you see how much of your attraction you throw away when you stoop to lying? By a frank admission, how many faults you might redeem. Really, you are far less intelligent than I supposed. In vain, however, did Swann expound to her thus all the reasons that she had for not lying. They might have succeeded in overthrowing any universal system of mendacity, but Odette had no such system. She contented herself, merely, whenever she wished Swann to remain in ignorance of anything that she had done, with not telling him of it, so that a lie was, to her, something to be used only as a special expedient, and the one thing that could make her decide whether she would avail herself of a lie or not was a reason which, too, was of a special and contingent order, namely the risk of Swann's discovering that she had not told him the truth. Physically she was passing through an unfortunate phase. She was growing stouter, and the expressive, sorrowful charm, the surprised, wistful expressions which she had formerly had, seemed to have vanished with her first youth, with the result that she became most precious to Swann at the very moment when he found her distinctly less good-looking. He would gaze at her for hours on end, trying to recapture the charm which he had once seen in her, and could not find again. And yet the knowledge that, within this new and strange chrysalis, it was still Odette that lurked, still the same volatile temperament, artful and evasive, was enough to keep Swann seeking, with as much passion as ever, to captivate her. Then he would look at photographs of her taken 2 years before, and would remember how exquisite she had been, and that would console him a little for all the sufferings that he voluntarily endured on her account. When the Verdurins took her off to Saint-Germain, or to Chatou, or to Milan, as often as not, if the weather was fine, they would propose to remain there for the night, and not go home until next day. Madame Verdurin would endeavour to set at rest the scruples of the pianist, whose aunt had remained in Paris. She will be only too glad to be rid of you for a day. How on earth could she be anxious, when she knows you're with us? Anyhow, I'll take you all under my wing. She can put the blame on me. If this attempt failed, Monsieur Verdurin would set off across country until he came to a telegraph office or some other kind of messenger, after first finding out which of the faithful had anyone whom they must warn, when Odette would thank him and assure him that she had no message for anyone, for she had told Swann once and for all that she could not possibly send messages to him before all those people without compromising herself. Sometimes she would be absent for several days on end, when the Verdurins took her to see the tombs at Dreux, or to Compiègne, on the painter's advice, to watch the sun setting through the forest, after which they went on to the Château of Pierrefonds. To think that she could really visit historic buildings with me, who have spent 10 years in the study of architecture, who am constantly bombarded by people who really count, to take them over Beauvais or Saint-Luc-de-Node, and refuse to take anyone but her, And instead of that, she trundles off with the lowest, the most brutally degraded of creatures, to go into ecstasies over the petrified excretions of Louis Philippe and Viollet le Duc. One hardly needs much knowledge of art, I should say, to do that, though surely, even without any particularly refined sense of smell, one would not deliberately choose to spend a holiday in the latrines so as to be within range of their fragrant exhalations. But when she had set off for Dreux or Pierrefonds, alas, without allowing him to appear there, as though by accident, at her side, for, as she said, that would create a dreadful impression, he would plunge into the most intoxicating romance in the lover's library, the railway timetable, from which he learned the ways of joining her there in the afternoon, in the evening, even in the morning. The ways, more than that, the authority, the right to join her. For after all, the timetable and the trains themselves were not meant for dogs. If the public were carefully informed by means of printed advertisements that at 8 o'clock in the morning a train started for Pierrefonds, which arrived there at 10, that could only be because going to Pierrefonds was a lawful act for which permission from Odette would be superfluous, an act, moreover, which might be performed from a motive altogether different from the desire to see Odette, since persons who had never even heard of her performed it daily, and in such numbers as justified the labour and expense of stoking the engines. So it came to this, that she could not prevent him from going to Pierrefonds, if he chose to do so. Now that was precisely what he found that he did choose to do, and would at that moment be doing, were he, like the travelling public, not acquainted with Odette. For a long time past he had wanted to form a more definite impression of Viollet le Duc's work as a restorer, and the weather being what it was, he felt an overwhelming desire to spend the day roaming in the forest of Compiègne. It was, indeed, a piece of bad luck that she had forbidden him access to the one spot that tempted him today. Today! Why, if he went down there, in defiance of her prohibition, he would be able to see her that very day. But then, whereas, if she had met, at Pierrefonds, someone who did not matter, she would have hailed him with obvious pleasure. What! You here? And would have invited him to come and see her at the hotel where she was staying with the Verdurins. If, on the other hand, it was himself, Swann, that she encountered there, she would be annoyed, would complain that she was being followed, would love him less in consequence, might even turn away in anger when she caught sight of him. So then, I am not to be allowed to go away for a day anywhere, she would reproach him on her return, whereas, in fact, it was he himself who was not allowed to go.